Yeah, as Chris said, my name is Mark Finney. I'm an architect and I'm co-director of Seb Fin Architects, which is a small practice. We're based in London and Bristol. Um, I'm Bristol. My business partner does London, but we work all over the country. So I'm going to start off with a little bit about early part of the education before going on to sort of university and then working through my career, like Chris said. Um, I started off, I went to a state school in South Gloucestershire where I did GCSEs and A levels. I had a sort of keen interest in arts and sciences, and so I sort of did technology, art, and biology at A level. But what I would say is if you are thinking about going down an architectural route, it's definitely worth considering doing maths as an A level because that actually limited which universities I could apply to. And I hadn't realized that before when I was choosing my options. So that's definitely something to bear in mind. Um, I then went to Oxford Brookes University, which does architecture and it has a nice school of built environment, which I was really keen to go to. It's quite high up the rankings when I was looking at it, and I'm assuming it still is. Hopefully, I hopefully didn't bring it down too much. So architecture is a really long course at university, and you start off with doing a part one, which is 3 years in university, and that's your undergraduate, and then you do a year placement after that. And you do that within an architecture practice, and you should get paid for that bit, so you can try and earn a little bit of money whilst you're doing that. You go then back to university to do your postgraduate, which is now a master's, although it was called something different, a postgraduate diploma when I did it. And that's another 2 years at university before you go back into the working world and you work and you carry out your part three, which is whilst you're working, you have to basically get to the point where you're comfortable running a project. You have to do that and you have to document it and then do some exams at the end to complete part three. I did all of my actual architecture education through Oxford Brookes, like I said, and I also managed to add on a master's at the end in urban design because I was a bit uncomfortable designing at large scale and I wanted to sort of challenge myself in that way. Um, I started university in 2004, which is quite a long time ago. And in those days, the fees were about £1,200 per year. Um, at the time, that felt very daunting to me, especially for such a long course. But obviously, with course fees having increased so dramatically since then, it's probably much more daunting for anyone considering this route. And as a result, there are now apprenticeships, which is a different route to qualify. So you still have to do, as I understand it, your part one, which is your 3 years at university. But after you've done that, you can do the rest whilst working. And I think this is probably really worth knowing about because it gives you a way of financing yourself through and still ending up with the same qualifications. If that sort of thing was available when I was studying, I think I'd have probably gone that route because I really enjoyed that sort of working and learning simultaneously. It's something which worked really well for me. So after qualifying, well, after actually not qualifying, sorry, interruptions, very professional.
Quite all right. It happens to all of us.
didn't think my wife was going to come home. Yeah, so whilst I was doing my part two placement, well, actually, I did both my placements at a Bristol practice where we focused on it was a big commercial practice, so we did like schools and hotels, and that was what confirmed that I actually enjoyed architecture. At university, it was a little bit more abstract and a little bit more conceptual, but actually working in the job was I found really enjoyable, and that kind of confirmed to me that I was going in a direction I enjoyed. Um, so after my second placement, architecture jobs were a little bit harder to come by because by that time it was fully into a recession. And that meant that I ended up moving all over the country and just doing whichever jobs I could get at the time. I did work in conservation and residential architecture in North Yorkshire, and that's working with old listed buildings. I did sustainable design in Manchester, where I worked with a company called Ecospheric, who we still collaborate with now, and they're a sustainability consultancy. So they help us make sure our projects are as sustainable as they can be. And then I also ended up working at a large like a large company specializing in retail, and we worked on sort of shopping centers. At that point, I think I became a little bit disillusioned, and I moved to South Africa, and I started working for a small practice where we specialized in high-end residential design. So think big houses for lawyers and holiday homes and things like that. Whilst I was there, I'd left before qualifying and doing my part three. So what I did is when I moved, I had to do the equivalent in South Africa. And this is another thing to be aware of. There is an ability to transition between countries in Europe. I'm not sure how that's been affected by us trying to leave Europe, probably negatively. But with further afield places, you have to basically requalify or qualify from scratch. So I did my qualification in South Africa. I then carried on working for a few years, and I set up my own practice there. And then I moved back to the UK in 2019. And at that point, I had to requalify for the UK because I hadn't finished before I left. So I did that and set up a practice with my friend from university, which is Seb Fin Architects. So I'll talk to you a little bit about what that practice does and what my current career is. And then I'll go on to the typical day of what we do whilst we're working at Seb Fin Architects. So we focus on sustainable residential architecture. This is a really important sector in my mind because like 80% of the building stock that we have in the UK will probably still be here by 2050. So in order to decarbonize our country, we need to work really hard at bringing down the emissions from all the residential buildings which exist. And anything we add, we need to make sure are very sustainable in my mind to really help reduce that carbon footprint that sector has. The construction industry as a whole is very carbon heavy. So anything you can do to make improvements on that is really valuable. We specifically target a low energy building and comfort standard, which is called Passive House. And these buildings typically use about 90% less energy for heating and cooling than a traditional building, which would be your like Victorian houses, which are sort of solid brickwork and single glazed and uninsulated. So we work on both renovation projects, so we can upgrade those houses to passive house levels. And we also work on new builds. We've done a cafe in Bristol, which is Passive House certified, and we've got a couple of renovation ones which are called Enefit, which we've worked on one in Essex and working on another in Bristol, and I'm working on a couple of others I've got one in Manchester as well. All of these passive house projects, they have to go through quite a rigorous process because it is which is quite technologically sound compared to the sort of hitting building regulation standards, which is what most buildings are designed to do. So this kind of makes sure that the buildings are really well tested before they even get onto a building site. So you kind of have a good idea of how it's going to be performing before you start building. And to do that, they use a software which is called Passive House Planning Package. And that sort of informs your design. So it's a bit of an iterative process. You kind of go through a couple of revisions to kind of streamline it, make sure you're hitting all the targets so you can certify the building. And then the other sort of key criteria are the actual building fabric itself. So typically we triple glaze all the windows, make sure it's super insulated. So that's like putting lots and lots of coats on, keep it nice and warm in the winter. But also in summer that helps slow down heat getting into the buildings. We make sure that they are really airtight, which basically, if you imagine lots of drafts coming into your house and you're losing all that heat through these cold drafts, we try and cut all of those down. But then you want to make sure that whilst you make it airtight, you also keep the ventilation and keep fresh air in. So we use mechanical systems which ventilate all of the rooms and recover all the heat. So that's kind of your typical way of achieving a passive house. Our typical day is quite varied, and it all depends on what stage. We could be putting together fee proposals for new bids or new projects. So there's that kind of administrative side. we carry out site surveys and measure buildings. So before we start designing, we need to measure and model what's there, and that sort of is part of that process. We have meetings with clients and talk about their aspirations and take project briefs. So we know exactly what they want for their projects and try and get a really good understanding of what they're aiming to achieve in it. And then try and sort of help guide them in terms of budget and sort of what's attainable, which sort of links into like planning. So we make the submissions to try and ensure they get planning permission before they start before they can start building. The other thing which I really enjoy is collaborating with other specialists. So we work a lot with structural engineers. I've mentioned a sustainability consultant who we collaborate on a lot of our passive house projects. And I really enjoy that aspect of sort of developing a design and working alongside people who are more knowledgeable than me about these sorts of things. Architects tend to be generalists. We have to know a little bit about a lot. So we're sort of jack of all trades, master of none. So it's great that we sort of coordinate all of that information from these other specialists into our designs. And then we do a lot of site work. So we go to building sites. We check things being built as they should, and we help with problem solving, which is another thing I particularly enjoy. Working out how to resolve issues. Whatever happens, no matter how much planning you put in, there's always going to be something unforeseen on a building site, and you're going to have to address that. So I like working with contractors to try and help work out the best way of achieving what we need to do, and resolving those issues. And then the other thing we do is attending seminars and conferences to continue our professional development, and doing things like this to hopefully inspire future generations of architects to start in the industry. So I think that gives a kind of a good overview of my sort of education and journey to what we're doing now. And hopefully, if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Mark. Very succinct and yeah, very wide ranging. So there we go. That's brilliant. Thank you. I've got some questions of my own, and we have had some questions submitted before the event as well. So I'll get to those first of all. So one of the things that people wanted to know was obviously you trained in architecture and your A levels all kind of led to that broadly. Where did you get the skills to be able to set up your own business? And was it, what was the, the pre-prep before you did that? And then how much sort of learning on the job was there?
I think that's one thing which I found maybe they do cover in a sort of general sense. You need to have an understanding about what type of insurances you require, what registrations and accreditations you require. So you have a general understanding of that from university. But the sort of ins and outs of it, have very much learned on the job. The way when you work for a big practice, you don't have so much insight in how it's all managed. So what I found really helpful was working for both the small practice I started with in South Africa and worked with for a long time, and the smaller practice I was working with in North Yorkshire doing conservation architecture. Because both of those were really small, you get your hands into everything. So you kind of need to know what you're setting as a fee, how many hours you can then work on it to stay viable. And then teaming up with Seb, my business partner, he's got a lot more UK experience than I have because I disappeared to South Africa for a while, and he's also works for another practice as well. So he's got two jobs, and he's a director there as well. So he's got a good idea on how to run a slightly larger practice as well, and he sort of translates a lot of that stuff into our business to help make sure we're like making everything run smoothly and keeping an eye on our fees and costs and balancing all of that. So yeah, it's a lot of just learning it on the job, to be honest.
But you managed it. Well done. Thank you. The other one was around so you mentioned how it got more difficult to get placements as the economy changed and that kind of thing. What do you think it was that got you the placements that you did manage to get, like in the so in your part 3, and then is there a placement in part 2 as well? What was it that you think set you apart and got you those placements?
Yeah, I hadn't really
they were
thought
still
about
quite
that before.
competitive
I guess
then.
the initial placement was I did pre-recession, my part 1, and that was I mean, it was very it was a very relaxed, informal. It was doing architecture was doing really well, and it's quite easy to get these placements. I basically volunteered to do some work experience for practices during summer holidays from university, and that meant that I had some contacts there. So I ended up doing like a week's work experience, and then at the end of that week, they said, "Oh, do you want to stay on and we'll pay you for the rest of the summer?" So I did that, and that was really good because I kind of got my foot in the door. So I did just sort of work experience for free for a week here and there, and that sort of just got me in the door. And then it meant that it was quite, I guess they knew me, they knew I was a hard worker, and they were quite keen to have me back when I came to do my placements. Um, so I think that helped. And then post um, post doing my part two placement, so that's my second placement, when the recession had kicked off, the practice I was working with was also laying people off, but they knew that I was going to be leaving at the end of that year anyway. And so it went quite smoothly. But I had to widen my net, as you could see. I was sort of looking from North Yorkshire, Manchester, London. I was all over the place. And some of that was people who I'd met through uni who knew someone who had got a job in a practice and there was an extra space. But a lot of them were not, especially the sort of London-based ones, they were sort of short-term contracts. So they're like, here's your month's notice and your next contract for the next month. So it was quite a horrible time to be working in architecture. It's an industry which, as soon as there's any risk or fear of economic problems, then people start pulling funding from like big offices, shopping centers, stuff like that. So those firms do tend to get hit quite early off if there's economic issues. The residential sector seems slightly more insulated from it, but it's still affected overall. So yeah, I think it was a combination of, I was quite lucky getting those good placements to start with, and then I just looked quite wide and tried to sort of hit up any contacts I had in any of those places.